Zhongli is getting his second ever rerun in the second half of the Genshin 2.4 patch, and here is what you really need to know about Zhongli before you decide whether or not to roll on him. As always, as the title of this video would imply, this video is focused on a meta point of perspective, and as always, subscribe for more video if you're not subscribed already. Anyway, let's get started. Now when we're talking about pool value on Zhongli, he is definitely one of the more interesting characters. His pool value and power value will largely depend on your current account status as well as your playstyle and your skill level, which means that there is no universal answer to should you pull for him, and it really comes down to a player to player basis. In terms of video crafting, the more recommended advice is to not pull on him unless you have some good reason to do so, which we will cover in the later half of the video. However, if you do have some of these good reasons, then he will remain good value for your account and you can definitely pull for him and to get a lot out of him. However, let's talk about why he's not really recommended nowadays. To get started, currently Zhongli is played as a pure defensive support character in the meta, whose primary purpose is to cast his very big shield to provide massive amount of defense. And while there are other playstyles like main DPS physical Zhongli or sub damage burst DPS Zhongli, these are generally not really considered in the meta just because they're not really that meta, and in fact Zhongli elemental burst is just not really worth casting in general because it has a very long animation and recovery frame or end lag. So this often results in major DPS loss compared to if you were to perform any other action instead. You know, why would I want to cast Zhongli elemental burst when I can cast like say Ganyu charge attack? Zhongli is not recommended because he's a luxury with more characters. In Genshin Impact, endgame content are majority time trial, which means they have you racing against a clock in order to complete and beat the enemy before the timer ran out. And the major cause of the reason why players fail to complete these challenge is because they run out of time, and Zhongli really does not help in terms of getting a better time. On the other hand, if you could already beat said content in the given amount of time without using Zhongli, then you don't really care about Zhongli. You can already beat the content without him, and so getting him will also not really help you beat the content further. While it is true that Zhongli can sometimes increase the amount of damage you do by reducing the enemy resistance by 20%, as well as getting higher DPS uptime by reducing the amount of time you have to dodge, when you compare that into selling an actual support or a actual sub DPS, those character is just gonna provide you more damage than Zhongli possibly could. The thing here is that he just have really high opportunity cost, and with the increasing DPS requirement in Genshin Impact Abyss, as well as just more enemy being able to either one-shot the shield or just bypass the entire shield mechanics, for example like the recent Wolfhound, the amount of massive defensive utility that Zhongli can bring just doesn't really outweigh the opportunity cost of bringing in another support or a sub DPS. Let's take a look at an actual practical example of opportunity cost using the very popular team Raiden National. The Raiden National team is a team containing Raiden, Xingqiu, Bennett, and of course everyone's favorite xiangling. It is a variation of the national team that specializes against heavy enemy such as bosses, which is the reason why it is very popular in the recent Abyss, because we have the increased amount of appearance of boss rush chamber. And the question is, let's suppose we want to put Zhongli in this team because we really want the defensive option. Which character do we replace in here? You'll quickly find that it is very difficult to replace any member in this party without a huge loss of either in damage or utility. For example, replacing Raiden potentially would mean that you lose a lot of energy recharge for your other party member, and of course you also lose the Raiden personal damage and the overload damage from xiangling because now you don't have electro infusion, and you can see you give up a lot of damage just for the defensive utility that Zhongli can bring. The same can be said in many other top tier meta team. For example, in either Ayaka freeze or Ganyu freeze, there just isn't really a open slot for Zhongli. No matter which character you try to replace, you quickly realize that you're just giving up way too much and it's just not worth it to put Zhongli in, meaning that Zhongli doesn't really have a position that he is able to fill simply because they are already occupied. If you did end up bringing Zhongli into those teams, what that means is that you are basically left with 3 party members to DPS instead of 4. For example, going back to the earlier example of Raiden National, if you replace Raiden here, then you're left with Xingqiu, xiangling, and Bennett to do the damage requirement that you need to do. And of course, you still could beat the timer using it this way, but that would mean that you are beating the timer using only 3 characters to DPS. And if you can do that using only 3 character, then you shouldn't really have trouble beating it with 4 character, which again mean that Zhongli is just not necessary in the first place. However, the keyword here is of course should. As the old saying go, a dead character does no damage. If you're able to beat the timer using only 3 character to DPS, but if the cause of your failure is due to character dying and therefore they cannot deal damage, then in this case, Zhongli can be a very good pickup to assist you in that category. And this is especially true when it comes to even more difficult content like the Vagabond. And while Vagabond is still largely dependent on a timer, and enemy in Vagabond have really heavy modifier that increase their damage, or there's just debuff modifier that increase the amount of damage that you take, Zhongli can greatly assist you in those categories to prevent you from getting one shot and therefore failing to clear due to you're just dying. In fact, when you should consider rolling for Zhongli is when you heavily consider and would really appreciate a defensive option, in which case Zhongli does it the best. He gives you the best defensive utility in the game. Do know that in most recent Vagabond though, enemy could still pierce through Zhongli's shield rather easily, and the timer is a little bit more strict that it might still be not possible to bring Zhongli simply because you want higher DPS for the maximum amount of point. But anyway, when you start to consider for defensive option, either because you have the luxury of not having to worry about DPS anymore because your character are so strong, or simply because like the character require it and it's so difficult to play the character properly without factoring a defensive option in your party, then Zhongli is a really great pickup, because at this point DPS is no longer your concern or your worry. Your concern is about defense, about not dying and stuff, and in this case Zhongli is a very good comfy pickup and can even trivialize the game for you. You don't really care to increase your damage anymore, all you really care is just to not die, in which case Zhongli can easily allow you to achieve that. Zhongli is very helpful in scenario like these and are really good in teams such as, but not limited to, teams like Yoimiya, Klee, Mao Ganyu, Xiao, Double G, Hu Tao, and so on. These teams really appreciate a defensive option because most of these characters are very squishy. And while Zhongli is still not necessary in these teams because you can simply play a lot better, this team can really appreciate the massive defensive option that Zhongli can bring. And for majority of the player, it will make their life a lot easier when they're trying to play these teams. So this makes Zhongli a really worthy pickup if you're planning on playing one of these teams. Although again, do know that it is not required, just really appreciate it. And of course, there's one final thing about Zhongli to mention, and that's, of course, you know it, the pay to win factor. You see, Zhongli is actually a very good character under the pay to win factor, which might surprise you a little bit, because I'm not talking about his constellation or his weapon Vortex Vanquisher, because those all sucks. What I'm talking about is other character constellation or their signature weapon. You see, the thing about Genshin Impact is that you can buy damage, but you can't buy skills. So by increasing the total amount of damage output in your other party member, either by again rolling their constellation or getting their signature weapon, you might be able to overcome the DPS barrier even using only 3 party member. In which case, again, DPS is no longer your concern. Your only concern here is just not die and you want the defensive option. So putting in Zhongli could be a very comfortable option in here. And this is the reason why Whale very often opt for Zhongli, because their concern is not damage, they can just swipe for that. Their concern is the other thing, which is skill issues. Overall, Zhongli is a very good character in his own way, except under the massive time trial that Genshin Impact endgame is, Zhongli is not the one that you need. However, if you do decide that you need him because other reason, again as mentioned before, then he is actually a fairly good character to pick up, and he can even retain a lot of value in the future for the same reason, because Zhongli defensive is not only very massive, but it's also very universal. It is very easy to put him into almost any team that you care about defensive on, and it should make him a great pickup. Whether or not you should pick up Zhongli largely depend on your accounts and your characters, and of course your play styles. Is your character already really strong and they are strong enough to do enough damage to clear the abyss, so your only concern is defensive option? Or maybe you have the skill to push damage while avoiding attacks, so you don't actually care about defense. Or maybe you are actually the opposite, is that you are failing abyss because you just cannot avoid dying, and therefore you can really appreciate the amount of defensive option that Zhongli can bring. Of course, you can consider getting good, but that's not what this video is about. Regardless, if you have a good reason to pick up Zhongli, I think he is definitely a worthy pickup. It's just that if you do know that there is not much reason to pick him up. And that's pretty much it for the Zhongli rerun. Let me know if you're gonna be getting him or not in the comment below. And as always, thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.